Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World, where every word matters. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests in this next interview. Now this week, Brussels takes center stage as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy arrives for a high-stakes meeting with EU and NATO leaders, while the Western Balkan summit tackles pressing regional issues, from EU enlargement debates to the looming influence of Russia and the return of Donald Trump. The challenges for Europe are mounting. Joining us today on TVP World to analyze these pivotal developments is Marcin Terlikowski, Deputy Head of Research at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
So let's first take a look at Zelenskyy's meeting in Brussels. What do you think are some of the key priorities for the Ukrainian president in his meeting with EU and NATO leaders?
Well, I think that the top priority is to build a coalition, so to say, a group of like-minded countries who would continue supporting Ukraine in the eve of the upcoming, let's say, political solution to the fighting. We may call it ceasefire, we may call it a humanitarian pause in hostilities, but some kind of political instrument which will stop the hostilities is coming because of what President Donald Trump promised during his campaign, and he's continuing to do so. And Ukraine needs to be sure that if these hostilities are to be stopped, then the entire group of countries which have been helping Ukraine will continue to do so, will guarantee that Russia will not be able to easily relaunch the hostilities. So building a group of countries who would ensure a lasting support for Ukraine in a changed geopolitical situation in which a political instrument, a ceasefire, will be negotiated and will be implemented, is the goal of Zelenskyy, in my opinion.
Right, and how successful do you think these talks will go, seeing that there's a little bit of fragmentation when it comes to opinion of Ukraine? Recent polls are showing that war fatigue is indeed kicking in, and perhaps the political will in that sense to continue these support are also waning.
Well, I'm sure that the challenges are growing for the sole fact that the Western public opinion can be kind of tired with the prolonging war, with the images, horrific images from Ukraine, and that there may be pressure on Western governments mounting to basically accept what would be put on the table by Russia. And this is the very dangerous moment. Because the entire, because it is normal, it is how basically world politics goes, that what follows hostilities, what follows war is politics, is negotiations. But the West has to be absolutely wary not to take some very likely Russian preconditions regarding the status of Ukraine, the status of the territories which are under international law illegally occupied by Russia, and also the question of the future geopolitical orientation of Ukraine, which according to the opinion of its and the will of its people, according to the will of Ukrainians, would like to integrate further into the Euro-Atlantic bloc, if you wish, so European Union and NATO. And Russia will very likely put on the table some kind of wording, some kind of instruments which would make this conditional, make this something to be decided on a later stage, perhaps even without Ukraine in the room. And here the West has to be absolutely united to discard this kind of approach, very likely approach of Russia, and not only the West, meaning European allies of NATO, European allies and partners of Ukraine, but also the US. So this is the stake of what's happening now and what will be happening in the European capitals over the next weeks in January and February 2025.
Right, like I mentioned, a lot is at stake here indeed. Now, when it comes to the integration of EU and NATO, like you mentioned, what are some of the challenges? We can kind of expect Russia not being very keen on Ukraine being part of EU and NATO. Is there a world where we can see a Ukraine with the future closer integration with EU and NATO without formal membership? How might this work?
Well, the issue of the membership of Ukraine, both in NATO and in European Union, is a divisive one. We can clearly see that both in NATO and in EU, in the EU, we have states, the capitals, who say that this is not possible now, that it requires a change of geopolitical circumstances in the situation. So, for now, what Ukraine is aiming for is the kind of system of guarantees, which, as I said at the beginning, will deter Russia from trying to relaunch hostilities when Russia chooses to do so, when it feels it is ready again to reignite the conflict. So a system of guarantees, part of which can be, and I think will be, closer cooperation with NATO, building interoperability, exchanging lessons learned, hosting NATO troops on Ukraine territory for training, for education, for maybe joint exercises. That's, I think, in the cards, maybe not for now, but for later. And I think it is unavoidable. And as regards European Union, the integration, meaning negotiations of further chapters, and bringing some more economic freedoms to Ukraine will also be a gradual process.
Right. You mentioned something very key there, being the interoperability between Ukrainian troops and that of NATO's. I think we're looking at war in Ukraine, and one of the turning points is Finland and Sweden joining NATO. One of the things that people have been saying how it's so relatively successful is because of the long time kind of drilling together with all the interoperability that's already established. Do you think that would be something that is beneficial for Ukraine, where they could also kind of partake in these type of drills, these kind of integrations? So if Russia were to ever encroach again, integration into NATO will become seamless.
Exactly. Finland and Sweden made U-turns in their foreign security policy by deciding to join NATO, respectively in 2023 and 2024, when the situation drastically changed. So basically, they decided they needed to join NATO because their policy of neutrality would not guarantee that Russia would not test them. So something profound happened. We can say was a paradigm shift which happened in European security. But to be ready to accede NATO, to implement the decision, they were preparing. They were preparing at least from 2014, from the time when Russia first illegally annexed Crimea and basically orchestrated the separatist conflict in Donetsk and Lugansk. And at the same time, Sweden and Finland started a road towards NATO, building interoperability, building political consultations mechanisms in the special format of all NATO allies and these two special partners. And this, step by step, through the last 10 years, it allowed to build this, as you said, interoperability at the military level, but also a seamless cooperation mechanism at the political level, consultations mechanism. So, and with that in place, when as I said, this paradigm shift moment happened and Russia attacked Ukraine, these countries were ready. This is, again, in my opinion, this is the way which Ukraine will follow, and this is the way which will allow Ukraine enter NATO when another paradigm shift happens, and basically Russia will stop being a military threat to Ukraine and Europe at some point in the future.
Right. And also looking at Brussels, we also see the Western Balkan leaders meeting EU officials, which a lot of discussion is on the further enlargement of be it NATO, be it the European Union. Now, my question would be, could the upcoming Polish EU presidency accelerate enlargement talks, be it with cooperation with Ukraine or even the Western Balkans?
Yes, this is clearly one of the Polish presidency goals to put some more, let's say, impetus into the EU and NATO, mostly EU enlargement. Of course, the presidency, the Polish presidency is in the EU. And this will regard both Ukraine and some Western Balkan countries. So we will see, of course, what will be possible as regards consensus in the EU. But definitely this is in the cards, and we would like to have some strong political signal as regards the Ukraine's integration with the European Union, and a clear advance on the path of some Western Balkan states as regards their European integration perspective. But in both cases, this also depends on the partners, so on the aspirant countries.
Right. Do you think the upcoming Polish presidency's focus on EU enlargement will give some hope for tangible progress, be it Western Balkans, be it Ukraine?
Well, yes, this is the goal. This is how I understand the goals of Polish presidency, which is focused on security and different aspects of it, but at the same time to establish a lasting peace and security in Europe. Finishing the project of Europe whole, free and peace, the idea, the American idea, which kind of from the late final days of the Cold War, which informed American policy towards Europe and basically gave some kind of conceptual ground to enlargement of both NATO and European Union. That this project, finishing this project, is the only way to guarantee, as I said, lasting peace. And finishing this project means that Ukraine and Western Balkan states should be at some point become full members of EU and NATO. And not only these countries, we also look at Moldova, we look at the situation in Georgia, very difficult one, and we look at a very, very dire situation of Belarus, which is actually gravitating now towards Russia, but is not deemed to return to the Russian let's say sphere of special interest.
All right, very turbulent times indeed, geopolitically speaking. So we'll see how that shapes out and how the situation develops in the next few days. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input, insight, and helping us unpack all of these. Thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you very much for having me.
Appreciate it. And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.